Why is this relevant? And it's relevant, brothers and sisters, because it's about that fundamental idea of transformation. I want to start off with a quote from Elpis Israel, because while it's a really interesting subject, geographically and physically and whatever, and its importance is the moral aspect to it. And we'll see in our studies that we deal with the physical aspects tonight, the spiritual aspects next time. But I'd like to start off with a quote from Elpis Israel, one of my favourite quotes, that really is about the river of life, although it doesn't look like it necessarily. Page 52 though, "Ye are clean, said Jesus to his disciples, through the word which I have spoken to you. This word, which is defined to be the law and the testimony, is the great instrument of holiness and purification. It changes men's minds." So this is what the word of God does. This is how it transforms, if you like, people. It changes men's minds. It loosens their attachment to earthly things. It causes them to place their affection on things above. It creates a new and right spirit within them. It diffuses the love of God abroad in their hearts. It separates them from sinners. It leads them into and develops in their lives fruit characteristic of that repentance which needs not to be repented of. The only change we make to that is, rather than talk about it does that to others, it does it to us, you and I. The Word of God can transform us, because the Word of God is like the water of life. So let's have a look at the overview. So there's 3 headings there. First of all, Garden of Eden, which will be our foundations, which we'll consider tonight, Genesis chapter 2. And there's an emphasis there on water and trees. We'll go then to our reading tonight at Ezekiel 47, which emphasises strongly a physical transformation in Israel. And the emphasis is water and trees. Next class will be the heart of the matter, really. It's about the spiritual transformation by water, in quotation marks, worldwide. Water being the Spirit of God and trees being Christ and the saints as healers. So we're thinking about, in these studies, our own transformation, our own change. We're thinking too, brothers and sisters, about our future role, because that will come up very strongly next class in the leaves of the trees. And it's all about our vision. And I think I found this helpful for me to have a particular sort of picture about the temple in the age to come and the transforming effect it will have. Feel free to interrupt if you wish during the class to ask questions or whatever, make comment. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. It struck me that the foundations of these ideas about the temple of Ezekiel's prophecy, Revelation 22 with that last vision of the book of Revelation of a water coming out from the temple and the wood of life, that it really goes right back to Genesis, the seedbed of everything. So in Genesis 1:20, we're introduced there to the days of creation, the waters, and that they were going to be teeming with animal life, with fish and whatever. So water there is associated strongly with life. That's really one of the major ideas running through this. But in Genesis chapter 2, verse 6, we're introduced to the watering of the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Now this is before we get to the subject of the Garden of Eden. This is a general statement about how the earth at that stage, not the Garden of Eden, how the earth generally was being watered. The general watering outside of the garden was via, it says a mist here, and other translations are quite interesting here. They actually, a couple of more recent translations put it this way, but streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Or in New Jerusalem Bible, instead water flowed out of the ground and watered all the surface of the soil. Now what the exact arrangement was, I'm not sure, but the emphasis there seems to be the idea of water ascending out of the ground. Presumably this fed into the river which led to the Garden of Eden and which then was distributed. So it's a vast fountain-type feeding probably that was occurring on this occasion in the early days. But interestingly, in the descriptions here, we're going from about the physical description, verse 6, then Yahweh God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Man became a living soul. And then verse 8, and Yahweh God planted a garden eastward in Eden. There's a chopping and changing, as we find elsewhere, Isaiah 35 particularly, which we'll get to, in the, if you like, the physical versus the more spiritual. But a garden, we're told, which he planted in verse 8, eastward in Eden. And there he put the man whom he had formed. So it's an enclosed plantation, if you like. The idea of the garden is an enclosure. It's a protected area. Location, I'm not going to try to be definitive about that because I've learned that there are people, brethren, with very strong opinions in at least two different ways. So there's the perhaps more traditional view that it's in Iraq, the Garden of Eden, which was, there's a big territory called Eden, but the garden, which is eastward in Eden, is a small enclosed subsection of the territory of Eden. If we go to Ezekiel, it talks about Eden actually. Some say it's in Iraq, and this is where Brother Thomas would have viewed it, right down after where the Euphrates and the Tigris join, at the top of the Persian Gulf. Some say, or it doesn't really matter, and I suspect it doesn't. From tonight's point of view, it doesn't matter where it is. Others say, look, it's the finger points very much to Jerusalem. So what's happening in the Garden of Eden is mimicked in the temple of the future age, in the same place. I don't think it matters if it is or isn't in the same place, but the argument goes also, look, we can't pin it down anyway because the geography was changed after the flood. Well, why does it mention Euphrates then, if the Euphrates has got nothing to do with where Euphrates was after the flood? We asked the question. I don't want to delve into this too much, but I do know that there's very strong opinions held about those two locations, Iraq, if you like, versus Jerusalem. But the principle out of it is that it's actually the source of life. The garden is the source of water. It's in fact a paradise. The Song of Solomon in chapter 4 talks about a garden enclosed. And it's a lovely picture of the garden. It's a foretaste of a much bigger transformation in Israel. I've got quite a few extra quotes on the slides which I won't turn up because it's too much information. But there are two main features, brothers and sisters, which we keep on recurring on this. I know it's pretty darned obvious, but I think it's worth saying. It's trees and water. It's the pattern of the future. The water is the critical element here. Verse 9 then, and out of the ground made Yahweh God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Just put that away in the backs of our heads. Good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Then verse 10 goes on to talk about the river. So every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, as you might like to note, Ezekiel 47 verse 12 is going to say just about exactly the same. Revelation 22 is going to say something very similar. Now, what about the river then? Because that's our subject. And a river went out of Eden, presumably fed by that subterranean water, to water the garden. And from thence, and these are words I've puzzled about quite a lot and haven't properly resolved, and from thence, from the garden, it was parted and became into four heads. The name of the first is Pison. That is which compasses the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good, and there is bdellium and onyx stone. And the name of the second is Gihon, and the same is it that compasses the whole land of Ethiopia. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goes toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. And I'm sure we've all found those descriptions somewhat puzzling at times, because some of the places we just can't identify well. And some of the details, like there's bdellium, an aromatic gum and onyx stone. You think, why is that there? Or presumably the ancients knew how that identified certain places, and we might have lost that knowledge there. But what I want to really emphasise, brothers and sisters, is this, that the garden was watered by a river flowing through it, and from thence it was parted, and in fact led to or fed in some way, was connected with 4 major rivers which provided life. It says, I think the record to me is written as if the water originated in the garden. It didn't. It tells us that there's a garden, the water came from Eden. But the way it's written, it says, if the water originates there, and thence, from thence, it waters the rest of the territory. It's a source of water, nutrient, for the other places, like Euphrates and Tigris. So where is the garden? Well, what's it look like? What are we being told here? Help Us Israel, page 58, gives a diagram like this, that there's 4 rivers that come together into one river that flows into the garden and then into the Gulf. The direction of flow there is from these the headwaters of these 4 rivers through the garden down into the Persian Gulf. That's really a summary, I think, of what Brother Thomas says in Help Us Israel. The only difficulty I have with that is that what it says here is, and a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. Well, I read from thence as from thence, but then splitting into 4 heads, but it's 4 headwaters. So another alternative view, believed by quite a few, is that the direction of flow is, again, out of Eden, this general territory, through the Garden of Eden, and from thence splitting into feeding 4 major rivers. It's the source, if you like, for 4 major rivers. I am inclined to that. Then we've got to think, well, how does that fit into geography? I'm not going to go into that question because I really have found it too confusing. Brother Neville Rice gave a very interesting talk here quite a few years ago. Anybody remember that, in the rear hall, on the same subject? And he favoured that kind of picture, but put the garden in Jerusalem, which has got a lot of things going for it, but doesn't necessarily fit all the criteria, in my opinion. So, just looking at those, we know where Tigris and Euphrates are, I think, from our geography. Look, this thing called Tyson. It's interesting to note that that blue line running around there is a suggested place where that compassed the whole land of Havilah or Arabia. Because using satellite photographs, one geologist noticed a dried up riverbed stretching across an area of limestone rocks west of Kuwait, and studying on the photographs the pattern of the desert sand further west, detected a continuation of this riverbed. So there is some evidence of old riverbeds running around Arabia, which may be part of this Pison River. Doesn't really matter. 4 rivers named, 4 locations, or 2 known, 2 really unknown to us, and suggested maybe the Gihon was the Blue Nile, just to complete that picture of that, of those rivers. What's important, though, is the spiritual ideas, I think, behind this. So there's 3 Old Testament quotations that are really important in our subject tonight. There'll be Zechariah 14, perhaps we can turn up to that now. There'll be Joel 3 and Ezekiel 47 that we've read. So let's have a look at Zechariah 14. And Zechariah 14 provides information that the other places doesn't provide. So Zechariah 14 verse 4, so this is verse 2, it's after Armageddon, after gathering all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And his feet, that's Christ and the saints, shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, verse 4, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it towards the south. So there's a huge earthquake occurring here in the Mount of Olives. So we're talking about Jerusalem. And however we understand the geological changes that occur as a result of the earthquake, we know that place is profoundly affected by the earthquake. There's a great valley formed there by the splitting of the Mount of Olives. But furthermore, there's another aspect to this. Verse 10, all the land shall be turned as a plain. Now notice the margin in the AV anyway, my version here says compassed. All the land shall be compassed as a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. It shall be lifted up and inhabited in her place from Benjamin's gate unto the place of the first gate, under the corner gate and the tower of Hananiah, under the king's wine presses. So what's the idea behind this? The land shall be turned as a plain, and apparently the word there is the Arabah. Now the Arabah is like the Jordan Valley. So I think it's saying here there's a great depression or a valley formed around Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is raised up, as one translation has. It shall be lifted up. Jerusalem will be lifted up. It will stand high in her place. I think that's the really key part of this, that in all the earthquake changes that will occur, some areas will drop down a bit, but Jerusalem will be elevated to be higher than it currently is. And an Arabah, or a sunken area, will compass the land around Jerusalem. AV margin there is really quite important, I think. It's around it. So consequently, Jerusalem, as Psalm 48 says, shall be beautiful for elevation from the sides of the north, which it currently is not. Apparently, I've not been there, but hopefully those who have been to Israel will confirm that you don't get a particularly great view of Jerusalem from the sides of the north. Is that right? No. So, but that will change. It will be a preeminent city. How far it will be elevated, we don't know. Some have thought, well, maybe it'll be high enough to have snow in mountains behind. It's anybody's guess. But we need to visualise. We try to imagine what it will be like, brothers and sisters. And I think that's the point of this exercise tonight, is to help us just really let our minds run a little bit and think about changes, massive changes. A great city with a temple that's raised up high, visible to all peoples as they come to visit that temple. Pardon? Jeff Berry says it's going to go a mile up, I think. Right. That's a long way. That's 5,000 feet. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Anything's possible too there. So Zechariah 14 verse 8 then adds this aspect. And it shall be in that day that living waters, I like that, living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea and half of them toward the hinder sea. In summer and winter shall it be. So the Mount of Olives earthquake must open an outlet or an inlet, both, out to the Mediterranean. So living waters shall flow from Jerusalem. There is a river, Psalm 46 talks, I think that's the verse that says, there is a river which makes glad the city of our God. Psalm 46 verse 4. But this verse is telling us that the waters are flowing out from Jerusalem, and they are split to the former, which is the eastern sea, the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, and the hinder, which is behind. If you're looking east from Jerusalem, looking east towards the Dead Sea, just right on the top of the Dead Sea, and behind you, quite a long ways, the Mediterranean. That's the hinder sea. the Western Sea. And that the waters, we're being told, are split two ways. And all year round, that river will flow. It's not dependent on rain, which is consistent with what we're being told in Genesis about the Garden of Eden, by the way. Joel 3, verse 18. Oh, anybody got any further comments on Zechariah, first of all? Langdon. So Langdon's comment is very appropriate, and we'll come to that, is that the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, will also run out into the Mediterranean. That there'll be a connection through there, and I think that's probably correct. We'll see, though, there's a fine detail there that we need to take into account. Thanks, Langdon.
That's what happened there. Dead Sea is 1,200 feet.
Yeah, so Dead Sea is also, that whole Arabah area also has to be raised somewhat to allow the right water flows, but Jerusalem itself is raised even more above that. Now, Joel 3 then, verse 18, says this: "It shall come to pass in that day," yes, we appreciate if that's after Armageddon, "that the mountains shall drop down new wine, the hills shall flow with milk, and all the rivers of Judah shall flow with waters. And a fountain shall come forth of the house of Yahweh, and shall water the valley of Shittim." So it's a picture here of the people of Israel and the land blessed when Yahweh dwells in Zion. Verse 21, "For I will cleanse their blood that I have not cleansed, for Yahweh dwells in Zion." When that happens, when God is present, the people are restored. The people are cleansed. And there's a physical manifestation of that in a river, in a fountain of water, which will flow from the temple and shall water the valley of Shittim. So a fountain of water coming out in the temple area flows east from the temple to the valley of Shittim, or Acacias. Now, what is this place? Well, Joshua 3 verse 1 talked about Israel coming up on the east side of Jordan, returning into the land, about to cross Jordan to go into the land of Canaan. And they were on the east bank of Jordan at Shittim. So the valley of Shittim is just over Jordan, just about east of where Jerusalem is, if you look at the map. It was the last camp of Israel before the Promised Land, and the place was renowned for its dryness. So what we're being told here, brothers and sisters, is this fountain will come forth and will water a place that's renowned for dryness. It's also the place, and I'm sure there's some sort of interesting link here, where there was a reversal of the natural flow of water. Remember, the waters were banked up right back to Adam. And when the priest's feet touched the Jordan, the natural flow to the Dead Sea stopped, and the flow returned back to its origin, back to life, if you like. So it's a significant place. It's a place of reversal, if you like, of transformation. Yes. It also has some implications about shipping too, as we'll see. Now, changes to the land. I was intrigued in this, that yes, the water flows east from Jerusalem, but in doing so, and I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage here, not knowing personally the geography of the Holy Land, it flows through the wilderness of Judea to the Arabah, the Jordan Depression. So W.H. Bolton, in his book on Ezekiel, is very interesting on this. He makes the comment, "The Arabah is the name given to the low-lying lands at the south end of the Jordan Valley. The name indicates a desert steppe area such as exists at the junction of the Jordan and the Dead Sea." So that's east of Jerusalem. "A map showing the physical features of the neighbourhood will show that waters emanating from Jerusalem, flowing in an easterly direction, would naturally reach the northern end of the Dead Sea, Writing of a stream which follows this course, it is said, and he quotes an author here, it plunges down among the bare terraces, precipices and crags of the wilderness of Judea, the wilderness of the scapegoat. So barren and blistered and so furnace-like does it become as it drops below the level of the sea, that is the Mediterranean, that it takes the name of Fire Wadi. At last its dreary course brings it to the precipices above the Dead Sea, into which it shoots its scanty winter waters, but all summer it is dry. So we'll see, when we just turn over next to Isaiah 35, that's where we're heading, we'll see that's a very interesting fulfilment of the words of Isaiah 35. Just before, as we're doing that though, feel free to turn to Isaiah 35. It says, the same writer gives expression to, the course of the water described by Ezekiel forms a happy parable of the influence that will flow from the sanctuary. Now, brothers and sisters, that writer, and Brother Bolton's capturing of that, is what this is all about. The water's one thing, sure, but it's actually a parable of the influence that will flow from the sanctuary, the temple. It's about the spiritual dimension, really. It's not so much about the physical water. And the writer goes on to say, and he was, so there is nothing too sunken, too useless, too doomed, but by the grace of God it may be redeemed, lifted and made rich with life. The words are a happy comment and lesson that may be learned from the waters that are to issue from under the sanctuary, making the waters of the Dead Sea productive. I think that's an amazing comment there. But just thinking about Isaiah 35, now bearing in mind that quotation from that book talked about the wilderness of Judea and a very dry and arid sort of place, if we read then Isaiah 35 with that in mind, we get, I think, a really interesting perspective. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them. I think that's for redeemed Israel. And the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly, rejoice even with joy and singing. Verse 2 and now verse 6. Then the second part of verse 6. For in the wilderness shall waters break out and streams in the desert. And the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. In the habitation of dragons, where each lay, shall be the grass with reeds and rushes. Now, if we then think of Isaiah 35 as the wilderness of Judea, we can see a very obvious fulfilment in the issuing of the waters from the temple east through that wilderness to transform them. Now, I know that the wilderness and some other ideas about this are about the transformation of people, and we see that in this chapter. It's interesting to note how the words just weave again. Verses 1 and 2 are about the change in the topography. Verse 3, strengthen ye the weak hands. Verse 4, be strong, fear not. He will come and save you. The eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Lame men shall meet leapers and heart. But then the waters will break forth in the wilderness. You see what I mean? It's flip-flopping between a very natural physical symbol about waters and land to people being regenerated and improved. The two are linked close together. So that's the sort of territory then that's going to be regenerated. That's a picture off the internet of the wilderness of Judea. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them. That's what's going to be transformed, brothers and sisters. That's what's going to be changed. Extraordinary, isn't it? Parched ground, what does it say there? Not sure which word it is there, but it's glowing sand or mirage, as the RV had, will be completely taken away. There'll be natural and spiritual blessings, and the people and the land which are in a wilderness condition will be transformed. And Isaiah 51 verse 3 talks about it becoming like, the deserts becoming like Eden. So let's have a little bit of a closer look then at the source of the water. So roughly we've got water flowing from the Jerusalem temple of the future age, east towards the Arabah. It's cascading down quite a big slope there. How is it getting out of the temple itself? And here again I'm having to confess my knowledge on the subject is not detailed enough, possibly for some of you. In the pictures by Brother Sully's book on the temple of the future age, he has a picture just that shows two lots of water coming from the temple. You see the blue line across there and the blue line here. So out to the right there, to the right of the picture is east. To the front of the picture is south. To the top of the picture is north. Brother Sully puts two lots of water coming out from that temple, then merging and then potentially splitting later. But what's happening is at least the water, it appears, I couldn't confirm this, but I know Brother Thomas believes this, Ministry of the Prophet says the same. Water comes down from the altar and issues from the south side of the temple. Brother Sully says both south and north. Brother Thomas says just the south side of the temple. It comes out under the threshold or front of the east gate of the temple. So while this picture here from Brother Sully has it coming out of the temple area from the south and north, I'm not sure that that's reconcilable with what Brother Thomas suggests about coming about the east front of the temple, but fairly not too far down the track on the east here, these streams need to merge to form a single stream. So that's what it looks like. These waters issuing from the threshold of the temple on this is the south side, that's the east side. Brother Sully has the same sort of picture, mirror image reversed for the north side as well. So the point is, though, that water is emanating from the temple, from the sanctuary, just as Zechariah said it would and just as Joel said it would as well. This is one brother's attempt to put it in a pictorial form. There's Brother Peter Schwarzkopf actually wrote quite an interesting book, basically agreeing with Brother Sully but adding some more colour and ideas there. So we've got then Jerusalem, the sanctuary there. That line along there is that fault line, if you like, that enables Jerusalem to be seen perched high because the surrounding territory has dropped. We have a river running from the east, then splitting two ways, one to the Dead Sea, the other heading north and up out to the Mediterranean Sea, up somewhere by the rafters there. And note there's this little section here at the marshes. Now, Rob, you mentioned about waters from the Dead Sea flowing out to the Mediterranean. The difficulty this picture has, and I'm not saying I agree with this picture, it's just one that was around and it was helpful to talk to. There's nothing to say that that isn't joined up through there. If it's like this, that sea will be stagnant. It needs to have water flowing through it or be able to empty out. And that's the difficulty I have with this picture from the late Brother Peter Schwarzkopf. Just note down here, the marshes, we'll come to that. It seems that the Dead Sea doesn't flow through there necessarily out to the Gulf, that there are marshes, of salt marshes remain. Although it may be that it bypasses those, I don't know. There may be a continuous river from Mediterranean right down through that Gulf, there may not. and somebody much more expert than me can enlighten us on that matter. Some of Brother Thomas suggested, in fact, that Jerusalem would be a centre of navigation and commerce. I think that's going to be really difficult given the geography and given that there's a huge drop from Jerusalem down to the Arabah, even though that's been elevated. So I won't deal with that too much. What about this river of life then? Chapter 47 gives us 5 verses there which are, again, challenging to understand. Ezekiel is brought out from inside the temple, out to the east, outside of the eastern gate, goes up through the northern gate out to the east, and sees water emanating from running towards the east. And the water is gauged in its depth. He was brought by the man who had the line in his hand. Verse 3, when the man that had the line in his hand went forth eastward, he measured 1,000 cubits and brought me through the waters. The waters were to the ankles. And they go another 1,000, and he brought me through the waters. He walked through the water. They're up to the knees. They go another 1,000 cubits, and that's depicted on that diagram there. And lo and behold, the water's up to the waist, a suitable depth for baptism. Another 1,000 cubits east, and in fact, it's overhead and can't be crossed. So the water gets deeper and deeper as they head east. Maybe that's because a wide amount of water, which is coming out from under the altar, or whatever, is channeled and therefore deeper to give the same volume. But the key thing here, I think, is actually in the next verses, verses 8 to 11, about the water, because it's a river of life. Let's read those verses. Then said he unto me, to Ezekiel, these waters issue out toward the east country and go down into the desert and go into the sea, the Dead Sea, which being brought forth into the sea, the waters shall be healed. And the key word that's recurring through here is healed. Waters healed. Takes us back to waters being healed when? Exodus 15, I think it was. There was bitter waters at Marah. The tree was thrown in and those waters were healed. It shall come to pass that everything that lives, which moves, wheresoever the river shall come, shall live. And there shall be a very great multitude of fish, because these waters shall come hither. For they shall be healed, that word again, and everything shall live whither the river comes. It shall come to pass that the fishes shall stand upon it from En-gedi even unto En-eglaim. They shall be a place for the spreading forth of nets. Their fish shall be according to their kinds, as the fish of the great sea, the Mediterranean, exceeding many. But there's a contrast here. The miry places thereof and the marshes thereof shall not be healed, for they shall be given to salt. So let's have a quick look to see what this is telling us, brothers and sisters. These rather unusual details, shall we say. So the water flows east down to the Arabah and south to the Dead Sea. This description here doesn't talk about the waters flowing east and then north up back towards the Mediterranean. Zechariah tells us about that. Dead Sea waters are healed, we are told. They are made wholesome. Verse 9 is really interesting to note in the margin. Whithersoever the rivers, 2 rivers, the margin, shall come, shall live. So that sounds like there is after leaving the temple, there is a splitting, potentially as that diagram from Peter Schwarzkopf showed, a splitting to head towards the east, but more on the south versus heading towards the east, but more on the north. The key thing though is the waters will be healed and everything will live wherever the river goes. And consequently, the Dead Sea will be teeming with fish. Amazing. Fishing in the Dead Sea. And it'll be the same sort of fish that occur in the Mediterranean. That caused Brother Sully to say, I suspect there's one continuous connecting waterway there so that the same fish can exist. So while the water will not be a freshwater lake, it will be nevertheless equivalent to the Mediterranean and able to sustain fish of the same kind as in the Mediterranean. And there'll be fishermen at En-gedi. En-gedi being on the banks, the middle of the, let's go back a bit, because it was on a picture before. There. So En-gedi is about there, halfway down the western coast of the Dead Sea. There's Jerusalem, that red circle. There's the wilderness of Judea through there. En-gedi's there, and it is a bit of an oasis apparently in the wilderness, right on the boundary of the wilderness of Judea. So it's noted in Joshua 15 as one of 6 cities in the wilderness. And next door to it is the city of Salt, I think it says. David was down in the stronghold in the wilderness of En-gedi. And there were vineyards, though, in that area, presumably watered by the oasis waters. It's the place, though, Psalm 63 was written, where he longed in a dry and thirsty land for his God. And there'll be fishermen also down to En-eglaim, and it's not known just where that place is, unfortunately. But, verse 11, the swamps and the marshes will not be healed. You sort of think, why is that? Is that as a reminder of the fact that there is sin in the earth still, and there are certain things that won't be removed? Or is it in fact a source for salt? They will be left for salt, the NIV has. And Ezekiel 43 talks about the need for salt on sacrifices. Is this the salt mine? Is this the place you get the salt for the sacrifices? Possibly. So the other dimension then, brothers and sisters, of the water is the trees. Verses 6 and 7 of Ezekiel 47 said, "Son of man, hast thou seen this?" Then he brought me and caused me to return to the brink of the river. So they've been through the water. They've had perhaps a bit of teaching about baptism, because I think that's what the detail there about crossing the water is about. It's reminding us that in the future there will be still a need for baptism, and the principles of baptism will still be needing to be evident. And worshippers, as they go up to the temple, will experience that each time they visit the temple in worship. And Brother Sully suggests that I missed that out on the slide before. So there are trees, verse 7, on the banks of the river, with a very many trees on the one side and on the other. Now we get to that point. There's trees on the banks of this river, and they are flourishing. We know that from verse 12. They are doing brilliantly well, life-giving trees. We can't help but just think about Psalm 1 verse 3. What's that saying? What's the figure in Psalm 1? A tree planted by the river of waters. It's a tree that's drawing its water, drawing its nourishment, its life from that water. Jeremiah 17, 7 and 8 says the same sort of thing. Man who trusts in God is like the tree planted beside the waters. And so here we have a figure of a really important spiritual lesson for us. So verse 12, I think is probably a key verse in my mind in this section. By the river, upon the bank thereof, on this side and on that side, shall grow all trees for meat or food, whose leaf shall not fade, neither shall the fruit thereof be consumed. It shall bring forth new fruit according to his months, because their waters they issued out of the sanctuary. Let's just reread that. That's the key part. Because their waters they issued out of the sanctuary. That's why the trees are so well growing and providing fruit all year round. And the fruit thereof shall be for food, and the leaf thereof for medicine or healing, as RSV has there. These are life-giving trees that are being described. There's trees on both sides of the river. The leaves don't wither. The fruit doesn't fail, is probably a better way to understand it. They are like everlasting trees. It takes us back to the Garden of Eden again, Genesis 2 verse 9. Fruit that's pleasant to the eye and good for food. The leaves were for medicine. Why? Because the trees are watered from the sanctuary water. It's almost as if it had the elixir of life in it for the plants, the special hormone treatments for the plants to enable them to grow. But that's the emphasis. The spiritual dimension is not far away any of this description, brothers and sisters. It's particularly fascinating, I think, talking about the leaves of the trees being for medicine. And we know that ever so well. This is just something off the internet. Drugs made from plants. Theophylline, which is used in treatment of heart conditions, from cocoa. Codeine from poppy. Coffee has caffeine. Digitalis from foxglove. Nicotine from tobacco. Well, nicotine is an important drug used in medical context too. Quinine tree gives quinine, an anti-malarial. Aspirins from willow bark. It's for pain relief and anti-clotting. The coca plant provides cocaine as an anaesthetic. Foxglove, which is pictured there, provides digitalis for those with arrhythmia, heart arrhythmia. The opium poppy gives rise to morphine, codeine and opium, analgesics, good analgesics too. The Madagascar periwinkle, which is pictured there in the lower picture, gives rise to vincristine and vinblastine, which are still used in childhood treatment, childhood leukemia treatment, potent things as chemotherapeutic agents. There's treatment for Parkinson's as well from the velvet bean, L-dopa is extracted from that. I've got a website mentioned there. There's a list of at least 120 prescription drugs listed, not to mention all the herbal remedies around the world. Thousands of them, thousands literally, from the leaves and the bark and whatnot of the trees. So in the future, modern medicine will be very much helped by an understanding. The saints will have an understanding of this. They'll be able to distribute that understanding to the mortals of how to live better using the medicines gained from plants. Now, I'll finish off with just one more slide. It's to highlight the fact that when Jerusalem is transformed, the whole world will be transformed. Now, the very last verse in Ezekiel, the last verse in this section about the temple, these 9 chapters from chapter 40 to 48 of Ezekiel that tell us about the temple. How does it finish? A rather strange way, in a sense. It was round about 18,000 measures. And the name of the city from that day shall be Yahweh is there. Now, there is a little bit of conjecture about whether that's a hotel city to Yahweh from here, but my brother Thomas suggests, in fact, it's Yahweh Shammah, which is a new name for Jerusalem. Instead of being they shall see peace, Jerusalem meaning vision of peace, it'll be he who shall be is there. So for thousands of years, mankind has been looking forward to this vision that we've glimpsed at tonight, brothers and sisters. But by the end of Ezekiel's book, God is there. Now, next class, we'll be considering that from Revelation 22, which is a symbol of a temple, if you like, but is a temple of the living God. It is Christ and the saints who are the source of the healing for the nations. If there's any questions? Comments? I'll leave it at that.